Hello and welcome to this Chemistry World webinar, The Science of CBD, Exploring Safe Limits. I'm Natalie Starkey, Chemistry World's science media producer, and I'm here with you for the next hour, where we'll be hearing from two speakers working across different areas of the science of CBD, and I'll introduce them shortly. You might notice that you have the option to turn on closed captions within this webinar platform, so feel free to try that out if you find it helpful. The button should be in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, labelled as CC, so have a look out for that if you'd like to use it. I'll just point out that this webinar is being recorded, so if you miss anything today or you just want to go back and watch again, then look out in your inboxes for a link to the recording in the next few days. Now, I don't want to take up too much more time before handing over to our speakers today, but I wanted to let you know that as with all Chemistry World webinars, this session is interactive, which means you can ask questions about any aspect of what's covered in today's event. Please use the questions box to send in your questions as soon as they come to mind, and I'll be able to put those to our panel of guests in the live Q&A towards the end of the webinar. You won't usually be able to see other people's questions, but don't worry because myself and the Chemistry World webinars team can, so do start sending them in soon. Now, cannabis has reportedly been used for thousands of years for a wide range of ailments, but you might not know that the cannabis plant produces more than 100 cannabinoids, with the main one, known as THC, producing psychoactive effects. However, there's increasing interest in another of the cannabinoids, which is called cannabidiol, or CBD for short, which shares the same molecular formula as THC, but has different chemical properties. Now, with CBD being widely available now in a huge range of products, it's important that we understand its safety as a novel food. A recent and pivotal report by the Food Standards Agency in the UK has established a new safe limit for CBD consumption. And today we're going to explore more about that suggested safe limit and the science behind it. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our expert speakers today. Ruth and Steve, if you'd like to both turn on your cameras so everyone can see you're here, and I'll do a little short introduction about each of you. Hi Ruth, hi Steve, we've got you on screen, brilliant. So we'll first hear from Ruth Willis, who is the team leader for novel foods and food innovation risk assessment at the Food Standards Agency in the UK. She's got a BSc in Biological Sciences and most recently has led the team who developed the UK's provisional acceptable daily intake for 98% and above CBD novel foods and the first UK safety assessments for CBD. So you can probably guess why we've invited her along to speak today. I'm really excited to hear from Ruth in just a moment. We'll then hear from Stephen Alexander, who's been at the University of Nottingham since 1988 and working on cannabis-related medicines. Stephen studies signalling at cannabinoid and cannabinoid-related receptors and the enzymes associated with the endocannabinoid system. He also develops assays for measuring these activities ex vivo, as well as for high-throughput screening. So we're going to hear even more from Steve after, but without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ruth to share her slides and begin the proceedings for today. So let's get your slides up on screen when you're ready.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk today and telling you a little bit more about some of the work we've been doing on the safety of CBD in relation to food. So what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about why the FSA became interested in CBD and how this relates to some of the work we've got in terms of the novel food regulations, how those apply and what that might mean for how we might think about safety in CBD. Have a little bit of a discussion about some of the information that's available about safety when we first started thinking about this back in 2020, and some of the information we've gathered over the last few years, how we've reviewed it, how it's now being used to inform both public health advice, but also the assessment of new products entering the market, and then a little bit about putting that in context of other countries as well. So why did the FSA become interested in CBD? So cannabidiol, as was just explained, is one of many cannabinoids found in the hemp or cannabis plant, and obviously can be extracted either from the plant directly or also can be chemically synthesized. We're starting to see more and more foods entering the market containing CBD either as an ingredient or as a whole food. And so while these mainly are produced from low THC producing plants or can be chemically synthesized, there really is an interest about how these are going to become foods that are legally on the market. And so far we've seen quite a lot of applications at the FSA looking to do this. So we became interested about how we can look at this in a way that was consistent and systematic. Sometimes there's some discussions about whether some of these forms are food, and I think we've already flagged that there's been quite a lot of work previously in terms of using these in medicinal contexts. And of course, CBD, particularly when it's coming from a hemp plant, also has some interest in terms of the legal drugs area. And so those all need to be kind of considered as part of our wider management of these foods. We're also seeing quite an increase in interest in entering this market. So these are primarily in the food supplement sector, but there are also a wide range of other uses that we are seeing coming through, from beverages to confectionery. And this is having a bit more of a think about what that means for the safety. We'll talk a little bit more about the novel foods regulation and how it was decided that the CBD, particularly when they're extracts or synthetic forms of CBD, were considered novel foods. But essentially, there wasn't evidence to say they'd been consumed before, although other parts of the hemp plant have. And so therefore, they become within the scope of the novel food regulations. This means that they need to go through a safety assessment in order to inform they're being put on the market. So what do we know about the use of hemp and CBD previously? I think we've flagged some of that a little bit earlier, but we've definitely, in terms of the food sector, have seen that hemp has been widely consumed in the UK and the EU, particularly in the form of things like seed oils or use of the leaves in tea or as an alternative to hops in beer. But these extracts and the synthetic forms are something that are a bit new and have only been entering the market in the last 10 years or so. So what does this mean, the fact that these are therefore novel and under the novel food regulations? So the novel food regulation is essentially a framework that allows us to think through the due diligence for a new product entering the market. They're governed by a set of regulations that we've inherited from colleagues in Europe. So there's the main regulation, which is 2015-2283, but there's also some implementing acts that say exactly what needs to be in any applications that the people need to submit in order to get authorised under the regulation. And there's also guidance, again, that were developed by European colleagues that we also use in the UK, that set out some of the detail about what needs to be in those applications, and also, to a certain extent, what needs to be in the outcome from the regulator's assessment as well. It's very much a holistic assessment, so it considers what the nature of the novel food is, how it's produced, some of the key hazards that you might be interested in for food. So that's both microbial hazards and chemical hazards and risks. It also considers allergenicity. And there's also a requirement to think about nutritional aspects. So whether it would put consumers at a nutritional disadvantage is also considered as well. So safety is very much at the heart of our assessment. So that then raises the question, is CBD safe? And back in 2020, when we first started thinking about this, after it was considered that these extracts and synthetic versions of CBD were going to be within the novel foods framework, there was a question about what do we already know about the safety? And at that point, there was very little data. The information is primarily based on medicinal data, which is generally speaking at higher levels than we would see being used in food. And there was some suggestion of some adverse effects being seen in there. So these were primarily around effects on the liver, effects on people's behaviour in terms of somnolence and feeling sleepy, and also some areas where there's potential for drug-drug interactions as well. So at that time, there was kind of a need to inform consumers about how to consume CBD safely based on what we knew at the time, given there were already some products on the market. It's obviously based on the limited data we had in that space, as we just talked about. And so at that point, based on a review by one of our scientific advisory committees, the Committee on Toxicity, the FSA advised that healthy adults of 70 kilograms body weight should have no more than 70 milligrams of CBD per day. Now this, I should explain, is not a health-based guidance value. It wasn't a safety limit in that sense, but it gives consumers some idea about what might be an appropriate level to be consuming, given the information we had at the time. And essentially, the 70 milligrams was the level at which above we were starting to see adverse effects. So it was intended to try and help consumers manage their intake based on what we knew at the time. Given the fact we didn't have a lot of data, that then suggested there was some more work needed to be done in the UK. So how have we approached that? We began by requiring novel food applications for the CBD novel foods that were available and considering about entering the market. And those applications had to be for the substance that they were wanting to market, but also for the relevant proposed uses. So if they wanted to be using them as food supplements, that needed to be reflected in the applications. Because there wasn't the data to support that health-based guidance value at the time, we therefore were requiring certain additional toxicological data to be generated. And this has led to more animal data being available to support both consideration from a public health point of view, but also for the assessment of the individual applications as well. This led to over 1,000 applications being received by the FSA and FSS. And these were a wide range of quality, given different experiences of companies with the novel food regulation and the different sets of information that were available to people at the time. These are all being managed as part of our regulated product service, and we'll talk a little bit later about some of the processes that those went through. So now we had some data, we then needed to think about how best to manage that. And given the number of applications we had, we decided to batch those based on the nature and the composition of the CBD novel foods seeking authorisation. We found that it was essentially 3 groups of products that were coming through. Those that were of 98% purity or above, which are sometimes known from an industry perspective as the isolates or the pure form CBD. Those that had mainly CBD but had also another range of cannabinoids present, so were very much a mixture of cannabinoids. And those that had a range of cannabinoids present, but they were more equal levels, and there's some suggestion that those may be more representative of the level of cannabinoids in the hemp plants themselves. We decided to take these in turn, starting with the ones that were scientifically the most simple to evaluate, which is obviously the pure form of the substance, and began looking at that data. To support that work, we worked with the toxicologists from the Advisory Committee on Novel Foods and Processes, who were the responsibility for supporting the FSA and FSS in thinking about the safety considerations for new foods, and particularly the novel foods, and also the Committee on Toxicity. And they formed a joint subgroup to consider some of these issues. So how do we go about using this data? So the main factor that we were doing at this space was around considering the quality of the data. So particularly ensuring the fact that they were undertaken to international test guidelines, the fact that they were produced in line with good laboratory practice and GLP principles, the fact that they were on substances that were this more pure form that allowed comparison. And as a result of that work, there were 3 studies identified from the data that was submitted that were of the quality that met the criteria needed. These were all for test items that were either synthetic or extracts of hemp, but all at 98% CBD in terms of their purity. From each of the studies, we identified the NOEL based on examining the detailed toxicological data and looking at the effects seen, applying the toxicological judgment of our experts in understanding exactly what that point of departure should be. And these were identified for each of the studies. While we had this additional data, it was of course not perfect. No data ever is. And it did highlight there's still some remaining uncertainty that needed to be thought through, particularly around potentially the severity of their effects and how those could be reasonably interpreted using the expert judgment. The bioavailability of CBD, the pure form of the CBD, is recognised that most of the data we had was around CBD being used in oils, and so therefore there was a question about what that means when you put them in other food matrices, and that's kind of at the heart of some of the things we would think about as part of the novel food authorisation process. There was also some questions around what that would mean when you transfer what is essentially subchronic data into the chronic context and what that would mean for lifetime exposure. There was also some questions around some vulnerable groups. So these in part came from the work that was done previously in terms of pharmaceuticals and CBD, but there was some questions around particularly vulnerable groups for terms of potential reproductive toxicity and immunotoxicity, particularly for those that are maybe immunocompromised. And there was some evidence from that wider data set around potential for drug-drug interactions, in part because CBD is metabolized in similar pathways in the liver to some pharmaceuticals. So we applied a body of evidence approach. An ADI was identified for each of the studies that were considered, and they had essentially a safety factor applied. We'll explore what was involved in that in just a minute. Given the uncertainties, the approach may be seen by some as being a bit cautious, but this was about trying to make best use of the available data and ensuring the fact we could provide an appropriate basis for information to consumers and their safety. The 3 values were then averaged to form what is our recommendation for the provisional ADI, and this was then adopted by the committees of the FSA and then recommended to the FSA to help inform their advice. So that's where the ADI of 0.15 milligrams per kilogram body weight day. So what did we do with this information once we had it? I think it's important to think about the safety factors that we applied. So just to provide a bit more detail on that. So in addition to the standard safety factors you might expect to apply to toxicological data, such as a no adverse effect level, there was the 10 that moved from rodents to humans, and then the 10 that took account of variation within the population. There was also an additional safety factor applied, and this is outlined in the advisory committee's statement. This was essentially to cover the gaps and uncertainties in the data sets that we had, but also to take us from that subchronic exposure to chronic exposure. So the question then becomes, what does this mean for consumers in the real world? So the first area that we kind of addressed was this public health question and whether we needed to update the consumer advice in light of the new evidence that was available. So this was then done in October last year, and we now would suggest that consumers don't have more than 10 milligrams of CBD per day. This assumes it's adults and the healthy adults in order to come to that view. So if we think about what that means in practice, we're talking about 4 to 5 drops of an oil which has 5% CBD with the 98% purity. The advice also had some recommendations of some people that shouldn't be consuming CBD, mainly because there are uncertainties in the data. We've talked about some of those already. So it does advise that the pregnant and breastfeeding women shouldn't consume CBD because there is that lack of data about the reproductive toxicity. There's a suggestion that in terms of prescription medicine, maybe CBD shouldn't be consumed, or if it is going to be consumed, that maybe you talk to a health professional about that first. This is to take into account about the potential of any interactions that might impact the effectiveness of the medications that you need to be taking. There was also a number of groups that we were suggesting that may want to avoid CBD. This is because there was data gaps. So those are the children, prospective parents, and those who are immunosuppressed. So what we're going to do next with this. So we've now moved from kind of thinking about that from a more public health level and the advice to consumers to thinking about the assessment of individual dossiers. So far, 3 safety assessments, which is the outcome of the assessment by the FSA and FSS as regulators, have been published. And there's going to be some more coming through in the following months. These are primarily in the 98% purity CBD group, with work expected to continue with some of the other groups in the following months. For each of the novel foods, we would assess the data that they provided for their novel food on an individual basis. And once a decision can be made around whether that demonstrates the safety of the novel food and how they propose to use it, we would then compare it to that wider data set that we have available, which is encapsulated by the provisional ADI. And that then informs what the safe level that might be needed to be considered for authorisation might be. So it's very much a case of doing an individual assessment and then comparing it to the wider body of evidence, because this then allows us to ensure that we've reflected the potential variation from study to study. So how does this compare to other countries? We believe that the UK was probably the first regulator to identify an ADI. We know that there's a number of publications that are also looking at development of ADIs, but I think we believe we're the first one in terms of a regulator context. We know that in the US that the FDA, for example, are very active in terms of THC-containing products, but CBD products are perhaps less considered at the moment, primarily because they're being managed through their medicines pathway. This is something they've been trying to look at, whether they can do, whether there are other pathways that would provide a route to be considering these products. But so far, as of the decision back in 2023, they're still currently not permitting CBD in food supplements and outside the medicines context. In terms of the EU, we know that our colleagues in the EU and EFSA have received a significant number of novel food applications, but many of these were placed on hold back in 2022 pending further data that was needed. And it's interesting to see in their statement that some of the areas of uncertainty and where they think there's further data needs very much reflects both the view of the CAT back in 2020 and also the statement that was issued by the FSA Scientific Advisory Committees last year. So it does seem to suggest that there are some similar questions coming up in terms of cannabidiol and its safety and what data might be needed, and similar thinking in terms of how to make best use of that data. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight into some of the work we've been doing in the UK to think about the safety of CBD and the science that's underpinned it. I'll leave that there and pass back over to Natalie.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that brilliant information. That's definitely explained a lot to me about the new recommendations that have come through. I'm just wondering, like, what kind of data would you like to see generated on CBD for its further use in food? Is there anything kind of that is really missing? Obviously, you've mentioned those groups that we don't have the data on, but is there anything else that you think is missing?
Yeah, this is something that was considered by our subgroup as part of the statement that came out associated with the ODI. And there definitely is an element of there are data gaps. I think they would say that in relation to the highly pure CBD, more 90-day studies and more subchronic data is probably not going to be very influential as the pool of data seems to be suggesting very similar outcomes. But when it comes to some of those uncertainties, particularly around the reproductive toxicity, human PK data and how that actually is being managed within the body, I think those are areas that they particularly think that it would be really useful to have more of a look at, and then would help inform looking at the individual assessments for the individual products as well.
Yeah, that makes sense, definitely. That's so great. Thank you, Ruth. Well, I'll just let the audience know they can send in questions. We've got questions coming in already, and I will come back to Ruth at the end of the webinar once we've heard from Steve. So we'll let her have a little break for now, and we're going to move on to Steve. We'll get your presentation shared. We're changing tack now slightly, and we're going to be hearing more about Steve's work, moving on from Ruth's great introduction about the FSA work there. So I'll let you know when I can see your presentation. It's on screen now, Steve, so I'll let you take it away.
Cool. Okay. So first, obviously, I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to pass on some information about the cannabidiol from my perspective. So I've been at the University of Nottingham for a long time and working on cannabinoids for a while, and I'll explain why as we go through. So from the regular kind of thing that I do, because I do talk to a lot of people about cannabinoids, is I do explain that I don't have any conflicts of interest up front, because that's an important thing to recognize in what is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. But I've been working on the cannabinoids since the mid-1990s, and prompted by an event that we'll discuss in a second. And I've been fortunate to be president of the International Cannabinoid Research Society and been asked to provide expert information for various subcommittees of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, for instance, including cannabis-based products for medicinal use. So what I'm going to talk about today is basically around four main areas, although they're not equally weighted. But the cannabidiol, I'm going to talk about the biosynthesis, talk about why there are many complications about the purity aspects of cannabidiol, talk a little bit about the targets, but that's a very kind of murky area. A little bit about the absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, and then talking hints about the therapy and where things might go in the future. So as mentioned in the introduction, cannabis is one of those plants that's been around with us for an awful long time, and we've got evidence from China going back 10, 12,000 years for cultivation, and that period of cultivation has given us this idea of sativa. But it's a bidirectional influence, because obviously not only is cannabis being consumed by humans, but we've manipulated the genome as well for particular ends. The history of medicinal use of cannabis dates back to the history of medicine in India and Egypt, in Western Europe and the US. There was a heavy use of hemp, which is the basis for the fiber for rope and sail, and so allowed exploration of the new worlds. But it was really only as a drug of abuse that the Napoleonic Wars meant that people coming back from Egypt in particular brought cannabis for smoking and consumption in those ways. The British occupation of India meant that there was a lot of toing and froing between the subcontinent and the UK. And a guy called O'Shaughnessy, who's a really interesting character, wrote a large tome about the experiences he'd gathered in India and brought it back to the UK as something that could be of medicinal value. But with the whole process of restricting access to various drugs, cannabis was not exempt from that in the 20s and 30s. Both the UK and US limited that. The scientific exploration is kind of from the 40s onwards. There was a report which described the structure of cannabidiol, which was not quite right, but was a good setting for everything that followed on from there. And then in the early 60s, THC, that principal component, which is responsible for the psychoactivity that we recognize in the cannabis plant, was identified. And that led to the identification of the mechanism by which it's able to perform those psychoactivity properties, and the fact that there were endogenous compounds which were able to produce those same effects, albeit in slightly different ways. And that was the period when I became interested, because it was the capacity to modulate those endogenous cannabinoids that I became interested in. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about working with natural products is how good they are in terms of diversification. So the cannabis plant is apparently unique in producing this metabolite set based on having particular enzymes that it's able to exploit. One of them that appears to be unique to cannabis is this THCA synthase, tetrahydrocannabinolic acid synthase. That capacity is widespread in terms of the different metabolites it's able to produce, and these secondary metabolites that aren't essential for the growth of the plant are multiple, and they seem to be mostly divided around resorcinols. And as we've described, THC is the most famous by far, and that's the primary psychotropic actions. And this was described by the late great Rafi Mechoulam in Jerusalem in '64. So a question that's often asked is, why do the plants bother to produce those things if they don't actually need them for growth and reproduction? And we've hinted at the possibility that these are immune related in a very simple way for the plant, because it doesn't have the extensive immune system that mammals have, for example. The proliferation of those metabolites and our ability to look at them has identified that we've got huge numbers of bioactive elements, and many of them kind of cluster together in similarities. So we've the way I've described these here, you'll see that THC, THCA, and THCV are related to each other. CBD, CBDA, and CBDV are related to each other. But what we see in terms of the pharmacological effects are often quite diverse. So we've got a complexity in the plant which is really difficult to disentangle because of this focus on the mixture that there is. And the biosynthesis is really interesting in terms of what the plant is capable of doing. It uses the geranyl pyrophosphate, which is the basis for an awful lot of terpene production in many, many plants. And the other substrate for the primary mechanism for synthesis of the cannabinoids is the olivetolic acid. These combine to produce cannabigerolic acid, a single ring structure with a hydrocarbon side chain, and that's the basis for 3 different products in the plant. So cannabichrominic acid at the top there, which is 2 fused rings, cannabidiolic acid, which is 2 rings which are separated, and then tetrahydrocannabinolic acid, which is 3 rings that are fused. And a point to note here is that what the plant does is it doesn't produce THC, it doesn't produce CBD, but what it does do is it produces acids. So this acidic moiety is very much what the plant produces, and then at some stage in the future that's removed for production of CBD and THC. If we look at the sources of hemp oil and try and identify what the constituents are. So from those 100 plus metabolites, there are people who are able to identify, in the main, probably 10 to 15 at one go. And so this is taken from a paper where basically somebody went around the market in Milan and collected 13 different samples of hemp seed oil and tested the content of these various cannabinoids. And so what you can see is a log scale on the left-hand side of the content of those cannabinoids, and these 7 different cannabinoids on the x-axis. So what you'll see is that most of the CBG was at non-detectable levels, and then there's a variety of cannabinol concentrations varying between 1 and 10 mg per kilogram of oil. But the ones we're interested in are the CBD and the CBDA. So in some, there was no cannabidiol that was detectable, but in others, it ranged from 1 milligram per kilogram of oil up to 1,000 milligrams per kilogram of oil. And CBDA, the precursor for CBD, was also extremely variable. So I think one of the things that this highlights is, at least before there was the beginnings of standardization, that the consumer wasn't really understanding what they were getting when they were buying these various products. So just to note that the decarboxylation process that converts cannabidiolic acid to cannabidiol is non-enzymatic, and it depends really on heat and storage. And so that conversion is kind of spontaneous depending on the conditions. So generally, when we're looking at CBD, we're often combining CBD and CBDA together because the CBDA has the capacity to generate CBD. So I often describe cannabis as a natural product, very similar to wine, in that if you go into any supermarket in the UK, what you'll find is that there's a huge variety of different wines that some people believe they can tell the difference from. And if they can tell the difference, then it's a chemical nature. And so the same sort of influences that there are on wine are influences on cannabis. And so the genetic background, the growth conditions, harvesting times, preparation, and so on, can all influence the chemical composition, which can then have an impact on the effects on humans. So quality control is an issue, obviously, where these are illegal products. But what we're anticipating is that the commercial suppliers are much more regulated and hence more able to identify the contents. And certainly for the medicinal preparations, these are all very well disclosed. And we're anticipating that commercial cannabinoid preparations should be pretty well regulated too. Now, one of the things that comes around with natural products in general is that they are sometimes quite difficult to pin down individual targets. So whereas THC is pretty good at activating a CB1 receptor, and almost all of the psychotropic effects of THC are mediated through a single target, with cannabidiol we really struggled to find individual targets. So we've got around about 60 or 70 targets that people have identified in vitro that CBD can interact with. And these vary from a variety of receptors, modulating serotonin receptors, a couple of orphan receptors, possibly acting as an antagonist at the CB1 receptor, so modulating the effects of THC maybe, and that has an attractive logic for consumers of cannabis, but also a bunch of other ion channels, enzymes, and transporters. But one of the things to note about this is that generally these are pretty low potency. So when we observe these effects in vitro, it's really difficult to extrapolate to what effects we can see for CBD in humans in vivo. So that the identification of an individual target is lacking. But it may not matter, because if what CBD is doing is having little tweaks at numerous targets, maybe that's part of its beneficial effects, and that we don't have to have excessive manipulation of one particular pathway, and it's a kind of multiple, it's more like a kind of bed of nails type thing, where you're able to see a settling out of things across a wider range rather than having a pinprick in an individual area. So the administration of CBD and the way in which the body handles it is really one of the developing areas of interest in terms of the interactions, as well as Ruth alluded to a minute ago. So just to note from looking at CBD and the other cannabinoids as a drug entity, one of the main things we do in drug discovery is look at Lipinski's rule of 5 as a kind of guide as to oral bioavailability and oral usefulness of compounds. But with this table, what I've done is I've just identified in the top group the acids, the parent acids, and then the neutral products that derive from them. And as was identified in the introduction, what we see is that these have CBDA, THCA, and CBCA, and CBD, THC, and CBC. They have the same masses, very similar hydrophobicities. And so the ability to distinguish these and separate them in isolates has been a challenge over the years. If we look at these as drug entities, one of the things that highlights for us in terms of drug discovery is the hydrophobicity. These are very lipophilic compounds. And so the way in which we think about drugs is that they should be small, which these indeed are, but a reasonable level of water solubility to improve oral availability. And one of the early descriptions of CBD, isolating CBD from Minnesota wild hemp, identified that it was pretty soluble in most organic solvents, but effectively insoluble in water. And I think if I remember rightly, the absolute solubility in aqueous solutions are around about 12 milligrams in a litre. So it's not very much. So aqueous solubility is limiting, and that means that we'd expect it to have a low absorption in the gut. And indeed, when people have looked at this in studies, it may be edging towards more the medicinal level. This is indeed what we see. So this is looking at a group of male and female subjects, healthy, 18 to 45-year-olds, and looking at a single oral administration of 4 different doses of CBD, quite high doses in comparison to what we would think of as being the sort of stuff that's available on the high street, but to show the pharmacokinetic parameters. So this is equivalent to the clinical preparation Epidiolex, which is a solution in sesame oil. So generally people think of these as having pretty low oral bioavailabilities. A good drug from the sense of pharmacokinetic profiling would have oral bioavailability of 70%. So having 6% is low, and what we often see with that is intrinsic variability. So the PK profile is that it's slow to reach a maximum. So the Tmax is the interval between when it's administered and when it reaches its peak. And classically, that's 4 to 5 hours. So it's a slow absorption. The maximal concentration, the highest concentration that's achieved, and the lowest dose here that was used was 1,500 milligrams. So it's around about 300 nanograms per mil, around about 1 micromolar. And one of the interesting things that distinguishes cannabinoids from many other agents is that it does make quite a big difference if there's a high-fat food source available at the same time, and the absorption increases quite a lot. And that's possibly because of just getting across the gut, but it may also have to do with liver metabolism too. So just purely on the basis of what is being fed alongside, there can be quite an increase in the plasma concentrations, peak plasma concentrations at least, of cannabidiol. One of the oddities about the administration of cannabidiol is it's not quite linear with dose, and so increasing the dose 4-fold doesn't quite give you an increase of the same proportion in terms of the maximal concentration, but it's still an increase. And the volume of distribution, essentially a reflection of where the drug goes, is enormous, and that tells us it's being accumulated somewhere. And one of the classical organs where cannabinoids accumulate is in fat tissues. So we've got not just an issue in terms of low oral bioavailability, but a large volume of distribution, which is potentially a problem if one were treating this as a drug for drug discovery purposes. From how the body handles the drugs, the key route is cytochrome P450s in the liver, and there are 3 major cannabidiol metabolites that were identified in the paper that I'm describing here. One's a 6-hydroxy substituent, but relatively small amounts. So you'll see the Cmax is quite low. The 7-hydroxy substituent is rather more. And then the third metabolite that's identified, the carboxy derivative, much more. So what appears to be the case is there are cytochrome P450s, and we've identified at least 3 that are responsible for the metabolism of cannabidiol to produce these products. And they're all liver-based. So the other thing from this table that's worthwhile noting is that they have the same maximal concentration at around about the same time as cannabidiol itself, which tells us something about the influence of first-pass metabolism. So it's quite likely that the oral route of administration means that cannabidiol goes through the liver and gets converted to these products through first-pass metabolism, and that also contributes to the low oral bioavailability of these compounds. So the second thing is about those concentrations, which I've kind of dealt with, and the third thing is about how long these compounds hang around in the body. So with cannabidiol itself and with these metabolites, these hang around with a half-life of at least a day and sometimes more. So again, thinking about things from drug discovery, when we're looking at steady state levels, which would classically be 4 half-lives of elimination, these take a long time to not just get to that steady state, but also to wash out if there are any adverse effects. And as was alluded to just a second ago, one of the key things that we look at in terms of cannabidiol is not necessarily what it's doing on its own, but what it's doing in combination. And that liver metabolism of cannabidiol can be quite influential. So I've already mentioned that those 3 cytochrome P450s, 2C9, 2C19, 3A4, are ways in which cannabidiol is metabolized, but there's also evidence that cannabidiol can interfere with other cytochrome P450s. So I've color-coded those because the relevance is that there are 6 cytochrome P450s that metabolize 90% of clinical drugs. So, and you can see from the color coding that 4 of those 6 are ones for which CBD is either a substrate or an inhibitor, and it would tend to slow down the metabolism of drugs which are metabolized through those routes. And one way that is been identified that might be clinically relevant and beneficial to a certain extent is that this compound, clobazam, benzodiazepine, also used to treat epilepsy, is often co-administered with CBD in kids who have intractable epilepsy. And it might be beneficial that the plasma levels of clobazam are enhanced and the metabolite norclobazam are also increased with exposure to CBD. But it's not just benzodiazepine, so citalopram, serotonin selective reuptake inhibitor used to treat depression, can also be modified after treatment with CBD. And there's in vitro studies that predict a wide range of different structures and drugs used for different indications, things from treating excess gastric acid production to pain relief can be interfered with by CBD. So one of the primary uses for CBD has been to treat intractable childhood epilepsy. So these are Lennox-Gastaut-Dravet syndrome, tuberous sclerosis, and that, as I mentioned before, is this oral solution in sesame oil. And the doses are reasonably high, I think we'd say. So for a 15 kilogram child, it's roughly 75 milligrams a day. For an 80 kilogram adult, 400 mg per day. So that's quite a lot. And when people have followed these up, looking for the adverse effects, most of them are fairly mild and moderate. Things like fatigue and drowsiness, occasional headaches, nausea, GI disturbance, and that's quite what you'd expect with an oral administration of something which is poorly absorbed. Occasional mood changes and appetite suppression. But generally, these are mild and tolerable. If you look at what's in the pipeline, there are a huge number of clinical trials registered for the use of CBD. And the sort of things that are being looked at are psychiatric effects. And although we commonly use the description that CBD is not psychoactive. It's probably a little bit of a misunderstanding. It's not psychotropic in the way that THC is, but it can have activity on psychological effects. So things from substance use disorders to anxiety disorders, suggestions that might be involvement in post-traumatic stress disorder, and a whole wealth of other things. So I think one of the things that's intriguing about CBD is the ways in which people suggest that there may be therapeutic benefit, a huge range of different topics. And obviously the proof of the pudding will be in the eating for those. So if we reflect on CBD and its kind of overlap between medicinal and non-medicinal use, I think one of the things that's apparent is that there's a huge market for it. The consumption is widespread in all sorts of spheres across all sorts of countries. It's anticipated to reach a multi-billion stage by 2025. We've got evidence that it's well tolerated on its own, but I think one of the things to be cautious about in the future particularly is this idea that it can change the way in which drugs are metabolized and other compounds that we take as supplements. And so there has to be some caution about the co-administration of CBD with other compounds. And that's, I think, where I'm happy to finish.
That's brilliant. Wow, thank you. That covered so much information. And actually, we've had so many questions in, and you've already answered some of those questions during your presentation, which is always lovely. So, yeah, the people that sent in the questions are particularly about the drug interactions. It was all perfectly answered in one of your slides there. So I was about to ask you that question. I thought, I don't need to ask that one now. But I did have a question about, you obviously spoke a lot about taking CBD orally. I'm guessing that's not the only way to administer it. And have you looked at anyone looks at any of that?
So that's one of the preferred ways, but clearly, the history of cannabis is that people have smoked it. So there are versions which, in theory, could be inhaled. There are expectations that some topical, so on the skin surface, might be useful. They're very much less well researched than the oral administration route, and clearly. That's where the focus for most of us in the West would be, is for oral administration. So I think there are interesting alternatives, but they're not yet well documented in terms of the potential absorption and whether they have any beneficial effects.
Absolutely. I'm going to welcome Ruth back on screen now, if you're still there, Ruth. Hopefully you can get your camera back on, because we've got so many questions coming in from the audience, which is lovely. So do keep sending them in, because we've got quite a few minutes left. I'm going to start, let me see, where shall I start with these questions? We've got so many. Let me see, I did have one lined up, but that was for Steve. So let me start around, yeah, actually, maybe this one is for Steve as well. We'll come back to you in a moment, Ruth, but you might want to add anything to it anyway. It's quite a long question. I'll try and summarise. So the question says there's still quite a lot of confusion around the legality of CBD products based on trace amounts of THC being present within the products. And apparently some papers have been published to show that often the labels don't match the contents, which is quite worrying. So how are people able to ensure that, if they're CBD users, they're not unwillingly breaking the law and having inadvertently taking THC without their knowledge? I don't know if either of you have anything to add on that. That's quite an interesting one.
So I think, if I remember rightly, the Misuse of Drugs Act allows unknowing use. So a defence would be that you weren't deliberately seeking to use THC. But of course, one of the reasons why people are going to CBD over THC is they don't want the psychotropic effects. They don't want the dissociation from the environment. So that would be an unwanted thing for them to be doing. But I think and I guess this is where Ruth comes in terms of the FSA's advice, is how those manufacturers are self-regulating, how they're limiting the content of THC in their CBD products.
Yeah, to come in on some of that. So we know that colleagues in the Home Office are doing work around CBD and what happens when you've got trace levels of THC there as a contaminant, really, because obviously most CBD products, they're not trying to have the THC there, it's just there as a kind of a contaminant from other places. So their council, their advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs has provided some advice about kind of what a safe level might be in terms of THC. And obviously it's something we do also consider in terms of the novel food regulation. So we would consider it as a contaminant alongside other contaminants you might find in a plant-based product. And that will be something we do consider as part of our assessment and make recommendations about how low that should be, really, to make sure the fact you're not having any of the adverse effects of THC. So we'll be thinking of it from a safety rather than a scope of the drugs regulation side of things. But colleagues in Home Office are doing some work in that space, and I believe a few years ago they did accept those recommendations from the Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs. We're just not quite sure about what that might mean for legislative change in the future.
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you. That's I think that's definitely answered that question. Brilliant. Okay, we've got a question about the number of CBD-based foods that are now available on the market. It's quite overwhelming. I don't think people have a good understanding of what it all means, and they think, oh, because it's being marketed to me, it must be safe, and they're telling me that it's going to have these amazing benefits. Who authenticates those claims? This question is asking, and what is the evidence required for this juice that I'm going to drink having some amazing effect on my mental well-being or whatever it is?
Yeah, so while that's outside the scope of the Novel Foods Reg, there are separate legislation that govern claims. At the moment, I don't think there are any authorised claims for CBD as yet, and they're normally in the health claims space. If they ever kind of move over to something that's a bit more of a medicinal claim, so if they were trying to claim that they help with particular medicinal conditions, there is work kind of done on the medicine side of things to try and make sure that those are addressed, and so that consumers aren't getting misleading information in relation to that.
That sounds good. Did you have anything to add there, Steve?
Well, as you say, the number of products that you can see people are marketing CBD with is enormous. So beers, all sorts of kind of gummy bear type things. I have also seen adverts for CBD infused gym pants. So whether there is anything that you can get out of those, I have no idea. I've not bought any, put it that way. Yeah.
Great. Okay, that sounds fun. Okay, so let's look at a question from Antonio. Sorry, I didn't mention other people's names, but I'm just going through all these questions here. How can we increase oral bioavailability of CBD? I think you mentioned something about that with, when you're eating with foods or something like that.
Yeah. So fatty foods, things with high butter content, for example, have been observed for non-medicinal use as well as maybe for medicinal use of CBD to increase the absorption, because presumably it makes it a lot easier for the gut to transport them. So it's something probably biophysical rather than anything necessary about the food itself. But it may also be that it slows down the metabolism in the liver, that first pass metabolism. So the actual kind of systemic concentrations do increase, and classically people talk about a 3- to 4-fold increase in the amount of stuff that's available. But it's still, the vast majority just goes straight through as metabolized and excreted. Yeah.
Okay. And actually, in relation to that, it's a good question. Is there a particular time of day that it's helpful to take CBD, or have any studies been done into, whether it's better to take it in the morning or before bed, or?
So little bits. I mean, there's beginning to be accumulating some evidence for promoting sleep patterns. So I think, if one were looking for something like that, and sleep obviously has a major impact on many other things in our lives, mental health and all sorts of other stuff as well. So there is beginning to be some evidence that towards the evening may be better. But they're still in preliminary stages, and the precise mechanism for that. So we definitely have daily spikes in particular hormones. Cortisol is high in the morning and then slows down, and maybe it's something as simple as that, as the other hormones that are active are actually interfering with the mechanism of action, and so you maybe get a better impact later in the day. But it's still one of those areas that I think is interesting, but not yet fully explored.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always lots more data to gather, isn't there? I'm just going to point out again, I don't know if we've shared this, but I've just seen in the chat that Ruth has actually shared with us the consumer advice that came from the FSA, which I think is quite good to share at this point as well, because, we've all probably seen these CBD products and we've all been wondering what's safe. We know what the recommendations are, but actually there's a lot more advice in there that you might want to go and look at. So I think, my colleagues just shared that in the chat for you. So do take a look at that because, it's fine to be curious and have a look what you want to do, but obviously you want to check that you're going to try out these products safely if you're interested. So have a look at that information. I've got a question that came in, Ruth, when you were talking, and now I can't remember what it was referring to, but I remember it being a good question at the time. And it's from Dirk. They say, is the data of the 3 studies published? I think you must have mentioned studies, and I'm very sorry that I can't remember what the
So I think it's probably related to the 3 studies that underpin the provisional ADI. So people often ask us, is that data in the public domain? And of course, because they were submitted as part of novel food applications, they're subject to a certain level of protection in terms of confidentiality and data protection. So while summaries of that data are included in that statement in terms of giving some indications about what the no observed effect level seen in those studies and some of the effects that related to that, the studies themselves are not actually published in the public domain, as far as we know. They may be have been done since, but obviously from our point of view, we obviously can't release that information because it's been provided as part of a regulatory process.
I see. Okay, so in terms of the data sets that the FSA has versus the Europeans and the Americans, are we all looking at different data sets then? Is that how it stands at the moment?
Potentially, or they might all be the same. We don't know. We don't compare notes as much as we might like. But I think it would probably be safe to say that, particularly where between us and Europe, there probably are products that are both seeking to be on both the UK and the European market. And for those, you probably would expect the same data has been submitted to both. That does happen with normal other novel foods, for example, that we see going through our process. So we probably expect that. I think in terms of the Americans and maybe other countries as well, it's a slightly different requirements because they don't have the novel foods regulations in quite the same form and they manage them in different ways. But some of the data, for one, will be underpinning others. And certainly where it comes to medicinal data, I think some of that is also fairly international in terms of how it's being used for different regulators.
Right, okay. Now, a great question has come in, which I've also been thinking about. Basically, how often are these, well, it's the first time you've obviously come up with a safe limit for CBD, but how often will this be reviewed? Is this something that is going to be reviewed on a regular basis when you get new data or on a 5-yearly scale, or what's going to happen in the future now?
So I think the key thing is about when we get new data, and particularly new data that isn't consistent with the wider data set. So obviously, whenever we become aware of new data, we do obviously consider about whether that's going to have an impact on the ADI and think about that wider context. I mean, I think it's interesting to see how consistent some of these data are, and actually that's kind of reflected in some of the information that's then going to be coming out about the individual applications. But at the moment, we haven't been seeing anything that would suggest that it needs to radically change in any way.
Absolutely.
So
okay.
Data arise.
Yeah, absolutely. And filling in some of those gaps, I guess, is the next important step as well, not just gathering more, but just, looking at what's missing. That's been so brilliant. And I'm afraid we are just about out of time. We've still got a few questions coming. I'm sorry if I didn't get around to it. We've also got some praise coming in saying some excellent presentations, which I completely agree with. So thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. It's been really insightful. I've really enjoyed learning about a little bit more about CBD. So thank you so much to both of you for sharing all your knowledge. In the audience, if you missed anything today, you will get a recording of the webinar. If you joined us late, don't worry, you can catch up. We'll send out in an email a recording to you in the next few days. And thank you so much for getting really involved in the questions box. It's great to see a really engaged audience, and it obviously shows that you enjoyed the content that was presented today. So thank you so much. If you've enjoyed this webinar, then we have lots of upcoming webinars on a whole range of chemical sciences topics. So please go to chemistryworld.com/webinars for all our future events. Everything's free and you can sign up to any of those to attend. If you can't attend live, we'll send you a recording, so you don't even need to be there live to see what's happening. But that is all we have time for today. So from everyone here at Chemistry World and from Ruth and Steve, we'd like to say thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in a future Chemistry World webinar. Thank you.